Hello all, I'm Dr. Fear, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. Like the video and subscribe, and please don't forget to tell me where are you from and what time are you watching this video. Now sit back, close your eyes, and relax. Lena leaned back against her worn hiking backpack, squinting at the pale blue sky above. The scent of pine trees was sharp in the cool morning air, and the distant rumble of a river provided a rhythmic backdrop to the quiet chatter of her friends. This was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of school, work, and life. But as the last few days had dragged on, Lena had begun to wonder if escaping the stress really meant being far away from it all, or just running from something she couldn't name. "Are you sure this is the right trail?" Lena asked, adjusting the strap of her backpack, her voice betraying a hint of doubt. Her friend, Jake, glanced back over his shoulder with a half smile. His usual confidence was already showing itself in his strides. "You worry too much, Lena. The map says this way, and this is where the adventure starts." Jake was the kind of guy who thrived on spontaneity. As the group's self-appointed leader, he was always pushing them to do things they hadn't planned for, to take risks, and to embrace the unknown. Beside him, Lila bounced on the balls of her feet, excited like a kid on Christmas morning. "Let's just get to the good part already." She tugged at the hem of Lena's jacket. "This is exactly what we needed." A remote place, no cell service, just us and nature. Lena couldn't help but smile at her friend's energy. Lila's impulsive nature was a constant source of entertainment, but it also made Lena wary. If there was trouble to be found on the trip, it would be because Lila had discovered some hidden, forbidden corner of the forest. "Not to sound like a buzzkill, but are we sure about this cave?" Tom asked, his voice breaking through their banter. He was always the cautious one, the voice of reason. "I mean, it's not on the usual trails." Lena could see the unease in Tom's eyes, but it didn't seem to affect Lila in the slightest. Lila, ever the adventurer, waved off his concerns. "It's just a cave. We're not going in blind. The locals said it's cool to visit. Besides, we've been hiking for hours. A little exploration never killed anyone." "You know," Jake said, pausing to glance at the dense forest surrounding them, "I've always liked the idea of venturing into the unknown. Who knows what we'll find in there? Something amazing, probably." "I'm just here for the quiet," Samantha chimed in, a quiet voice cutting through the banter. She was walking ahead of the group, always a few paces away, her gaze fixed on something deep within the forest. Lena smiled at Samantha's introversion. The girl had a kind of peace about her, one that was deeply calming to Lena, but even Samantha couldn't mask the underlying tension in the air. The forest, despite its beauty, was far from welcoming. The deeper they ventured, the more Lena could feel it. Something was off. The silence between the trees had a weight to it, as if the forest was holding its breath. As they reached the edge of the trail, a narrow opening appeared between two large boulders. A faint trail of footprints led inside. "There it is," Jake said, voice rising with excitement. "The cave. The start of our adventure." Lena hesitated, the unsettling feeling growing in her gut. Something about this cave seemed wrong. It was as if the very air shifted when she looked at the dark opening, like it was pulling her toward it. She shook the thought away. "Let's just get this over with." Lila was already at the mouth of the cave, stepping confidently inside. "What's the worst that could happen?" she called back to the group. "Come on, slowpokes." Lena glanced at Tom and Samantha. Tom's expression was unreadable, though she could see his shoulders were tense. Samantha only nodded, her silent agreement clear as she followed Lila into the cave. Lena took a deep breath. Her instincts told her to turn around, but she ignored them. With a steadying exhale, she entered after them. The cave was dark, but the air was cool and refreshing. As their eyes adjusted, they saw the jagged walls lined with veins of quartz that glistened like frozen lightning. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the cavern, creating an eerie rhythm that seemed to match their mounting unease. "I thought this was supposed to be just a simple cave," Tom muttered, his voice muffled in the quiet space. It's huge. Lila was already a few steps ahead, her flashlight darting across the walls as she examined the carvings that adorned them. "Look at this," she called, kneeling to trace the markings. "This is so cool. Ancient stuff." Lena walked over, her gaze following Lila's light to the strange symbols etched into the rock. They resembled nothing she'd ever seen before, twisting patterns and shapes that gave the walls an otherworldly feel. "Are you sure this is safe?" Tom asked, his voice tight. He looked around, clearly unsettled by the atmosphere. "Stop worrying, Tom," Lila said, standing up. "It's just old markings, nothing to be scared of." Lena didn't say anything, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this cave was more than it appeared. There was something in the air that made her skin prickle, something ancient. "Let's just check out the main chamber," Jake suggested, his voice eager. "It's supposed to be really cool." Lena nodded and followed, but she couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that there was something waiting for them ahead, a presence they weren't prepared for. They rounded a corner and the cavern opened up into a massive chamber. In the center, resting on the floor, was a large mound of bones, some human, some animal, arranged in an intricate pattern. The sight of them made Lena's stomach turn. "What the hell is this?" Samantha whispered. Lila crouched beside the pile, inspecting it with interest. "This is fascinating." "Don't touch anything," Lena said sharply, suddenly on edge. "We don't know what this is. It could be cursed." Lila laughed it off, brushing dust from the bones. "Cursed? Seriously? It's just some old bones. Who knows how long they've been here?" "Stop, Lila," Lena warned again. But before she could protest further, Lila lifted one of the skulls, inspecting it closely. A low, almost imperceptible sound filled the air, a faint scraping noise like bone rubbing against stone. Lena froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The scraping sound grew louder, echoing from deeper within the cave. The air turned suddenly colder and Lena felt her heart skip a beat. Something was wrong. Something had been disturbed. "Lila, put it down," Lena said urgently, but it was too late. The scraping intensified, reverberating through the walls. And then, silence. The cave seemed to hold its breath. Lena's blood ran cold. This was no ordinary cave. Something had awoken. Lena stood frozen, her eyes locked on the bones that Lila had carelessly disturbed. The scraping noise had stopped, but an ominous silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She felt as though the walls of the cave were closing in on her, the weight of its ancient secrets pressing against her chest. The unease she'd felt earlier had escalated into something far worse. "Lila, I told you," Lena started, but Lila wasn't listening. "Guys, check this out." Lila grinned, holding up the skull like a trophy. Her voice echoed unnaturally in the cavern. "This thing's old. Look at the wear, the markings. This could be worth a ton of money if we—" "Put it down, Lila," Lena cut in, her voice sharp with warning. She was almost frantic now, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Lila shrugged, dismissing her warning with a roll of her eyes. "Relax, Lena. It's just bones. What's the worst that could happen?" Lena opened her mouth to argue again, but was interrupted by a low, guttural rumble from deep within the cave. It was a sound that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet, sending a ripple of fear through her. Jake, who had been quiet until now, suddenly looked up, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Tom tensed, his eyes scanning the shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. "Yeah, we need to get out of here now." But before anyone could move, the rumble grew louder, followed by a soft scraping sound, closer this time, unmistakable. It was as though something was moving within the walls themselves. Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What is that?" she whispered. Samantha, who had been standing at the back of the group, looked around nervously. "I don't know, but I don't like it." Lila laughed again, though the sound was forced now. "Oh, come on, it's just an echo. Let's go deeper and see where this leads. We came all this way." "No," Lena said, her voice trembling. We need to leave. Right now. Jake grabbed Lila's arm, his grip tight with panic. She's right, Lila, we're not equipped for this, let's go. For a moment it seemed like Lila might argue again, but she finally dropped the skull and turned toward the path leading further into the cave. Fine, let's head out. I'll admit this place is a little creepy. The scraping sound stopped, but the tension didn't lift. The group slowly began to retrace their steps, moving cautiously toward the entrance. Yet the deeper they went, the more the cave seemed to twist and shift. The walls closed in around them, and the faint glow of their flashlights revealed paths that weren't there before, jagged and narrow. What the hell? Jake muttered under his breath. We didn't come this way. Samantha shivered beside him. It's like the cave is moving. Lena swallowed hard, her mind racing. This wasn't just fear of the dark. It was as if the cave itself was alive, watching them. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air seemed to get heavier with each step they took. It's not just you, Lena said, voice tight. The cave is changing. Tom, who had been quietly scanning the path ahead, turned to Lena with wide eyes. I've got a bad feeling about this, Lena. I don't think we can get back the way we came. Lena's stomach churned. The sense of unease had deepened into something primal. Something was blocking their escape, keeping them inside. Keep moving, Lena urged, trying to hide the panic rising in her chest. We'll find another way out. There has to be a way. The cave's oppressive atmosphere seemed to weigh down on them as they pressed forward. Their flashlights flickered, the darkness swallowing the light in places, leaving them with only the faintest glow to guide them. Look at this, Lila called, her voice coming from further ahead. What is this? The rest of the group hurried to catch up, and Lena's heart skipped a beat when they reached Lila. The sight before them was even more disturbing than the bones they had left behind. A section of the cave wall was covered in strange symbols, etched into the stone with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. They were familiar in some ways, twisting patterns that made Lena's mind dizzy when she tried to focus on them for too long. These markings, Lena began, her voice low. They're not just decorative, this looks like some kind of ritual. Jake frowned. A ritual? What are you talking about? This place is ancient, sure, but... Lena shook her head. This isn't just old art. Look at the design. These symbols, they're part of something darker. I think it's... Before she could finish, a low growl, deep and resonant, vibrated through the cave. It came from behind them, far deeper in the cavern, and it was unlike anything Lena had ever heard. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Tom cursed, his face paling. We need to get out now. But when they turned to retrace their steps, the path they had walked on was gone. The narrow passage that had led them to the strange markings had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of jagged rock. What the hell? Lila gasped, her voice shaking. The scraping noise started again, only louder, closer. It was no longer an echo. It was real, and whatever was making it was approaching quickly. Samantha's eyes were wide with fear. We're not alone. Something's here. Lena felt a coldness seep into her bones, something more ancient than fear itself. She turned to the others, her voice barely a whisper. We need to stick together. We have to find the way out. But it was already too late. The cave seemed to answer her with another growl. Closer now, just behind them. Something was watching. Something that had waited too long. The growl reverberated through the cave, vibrating in Lena's chest like a low, distant thunder. Her flashlight shook in her trembling hands, the faint beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. She looked at her friends, their pale faces illuminated in the flickering light. They were as terrified as she was. What was that? Samantha's voice cracked, her eyes darting wildly toward the shadows that loomed around them. I don't know, Jake said, his voice tight, but he kept his gaze fixed on the path behind them. But we need to keep moving. Standing here is a death sentence. Tom nodded, though his face was taut with fear. Stick together. No one wanders off. Let's go. Lena felt her legs hesitate as she took a step forward, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run in the opposite direction. But there was nowhere to go. The cave had shifted, sealing off the paths they had come from. It was as if the cave itself wanted to keep them inside. The group moved slowly, their footsteps echoing unnaturally. Every sound felt amplified, every movement sharp and invasive against the eerie silence. The air grew colder, heavier, until it felt like they were walking through water. Samantha kept close to Lena, her breathing uneven. "This isn't just a cave," she whispered. "It's alive. It knows we're here." Lena didn't respond. She didn't want to admit that Samantha might be right. They rounded a corner, and the tunnel opened into another large chamber. This one was darker than the last, its ceiling arching impossibly high. The walls were lined with more bones, arranged in strange, intricate patterns. "Jesus," Jake muttered, his flashlight scanning the macabre scene. "What the hell is this place?" The bones weren't just scattered. They had been placed deliberately. Skulls lined the edges of the room, their empty eye sockets staring into the void. Long bones formed spirals on the ground, leading toward the center of the chamber, where a large stone altar stood. "Don't touch anything," Lena said sharply, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Not this time." Lila didn't argue. For once, her usual bravado was gone, replaced by a quiet unease. She clutched her flashlight like a lifeline, her eyes darting to every shadow. As they approached the altar, Lena noticed strange carvings etched into the stone. They resembled the symbols they had seen earlier, but these were deeper, more precise. They seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, pulsating with a rhythm that felt disturbingly like a heartbeat. Tom leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "These markings, they're ancient, ritualistic. Whoever or whatever made them knew exactly what they were doing." "Yeah, well, I don't want to know what they were doing," Jake said, his voice low. "Let's keep moving." But as they turned to leave, the growl returned, louder this time, closer. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, something that filled the chamber like a living thing. Lena's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming before sputtering back to life. The air seemed to shift, a cold breeze sweeping through the chamber despite the stillness of the cave. And then, they saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded it. But as it moved, the faint light of their flashlights caught the outline of its form, a skeletal figure draped in what looked like tattered cloth. But as it stepped closer, they realized the cloth wasn't fabric. It was bones. The creature moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs long and thin, its body adorned with the remains of its victims. Skulls formed its shoulders, ribs made up its chest, and a spine curved down its back like a grotesque cloak. Its head was smooth, featureless except for two glowing orbs where its eyes should have been. Lena felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't possible. This thing, it couldn't be real. What the hell is that? Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. The creature tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. The glowing orbs of its eyes fixed on the group, and for a moment, the air grew impossibly still. Then it moved. It was fast. Too fast. One moment it was across the chamber, and the next it was standing at the edge of the bone spirals, its skeletal hand outstretched. "Run!" Lena shouted, her voice breaking through the paralysis that had gripped the group. They bolted, scattering in different directions as the creature let out a bone-chilling screech. The sound was unlike anything Lena had ever heard, a mix of grinding stone and shattering glass, piercing and relentless. Lena sprinted toward the nearest tunnel, Samantha close behind her. Her flashlight bounced wildly in her hand, casting jagged shadows on the walls. She didn't dare look back. "Where's Jake?" Samantha cried, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Lena shouted. "Just keep running." The tunnel twisted and turned, the path narrowing until Lena was forced to duck beneath jagged rocks. The screeching sound of the creature echoed through the cave, growing louder with every passing second. It was following them. They stumbled into another chamber, smaller than the last, and Lena skidded to a stop, her chest heaving. Samantha collapsed beside her, clutching her knees as she gasped for breath. Did we lose it?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking. Lena didn't answer. She was too focused on the faint sounds that still echoed through the tunnels, the scraping of bone against stone, the soft, deliberate footsteps of something that wasn't human. "No," Lena said finally, her voice barely audible. "It's still coming." Samantha's eyes widened, tears streaming down her face. "What do we do? We can't outrun it forever." Lena swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't have an answer. There was no way out, no escape. The cave had become a maze, and the creature was always one step behind them. But as she scanned the chamber, her flashlight caught something on the far wall. More carvings, similar to the ones they had seen before. But these were different. They weren't just symbols. They were instructions. Lena's heart raced as she stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. The carvings depicted a figure standing before the altar, holding something above their head. A fire burned in the center of the bone spirals, consuming the remains. "It's a ritual," Lena whispered, her mind racing. "A way to stop it." Samantha looked at her, confusion and fear etched across her face. "What are you talking about? What ritual?" Lena turned to her, her eyes blazing with determination. "The bones, the altar, we have to destroy them." Samantha shook her head, panic overtaking her. "You can't be serious. That thing will kill us before we even get close." "Do you have a better idea?" Lena snapped, her voice rising. Before Samantha could respond, the screech echoed through the tunnel again, louder this time. Closer. Lena tightened her grip on the flashlight, her jaw set. "We don't have a choice. We have to try." The screech reverberated through the tunnel, the sound growing louder and sharper, cutting through Lena's thoughts like a knife. She gripped the flashlight tightly, her knuckles white, and turned back to Samantha, who was still frozen in place. "Come on," Lena hissed, grabbing Samantha's arm and pulling her toward the carvings. "If we don't stop it, we're dead." Samantha stumbled after her, her breathing ragged and uneven. "How are we supposed to stop it with this?" She gestured frantically at the markings on the wall, her voice trembling with panic. "This is ancient. We don't even know what it means." "We don't have to understand it," Lena snapped, scanning the carvings again. "We just have to follow it." The images were crude but clear. A figure holding a flame above the altar, the bone spirals engulfed in fire. Whatever this ritual was, it was meant to break the connection between the creature and its lair. But the instructions weren't complete. There were gaps, portions of the carvings that had been eroded over time. Lena could only guess at what was missing. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic. "We need fire," she muttered. "It's the only way to break this thing's hold." "Fire?" Samantha's voice rose, hysteria bubbling just beneath the surface. "In the middle of a cave? Are you insane?" Before Lena could respond, the scraping sound returned, this time accompanied by a steady, rhythmic tapping. It was closer now, echoing through the tunnel. The bone collector was coming. Lena turned to Samantha, her eyes blazing with urgency. "We don't have time for this. Either we figure it out, or we die here." Samantha hesitated, her lips trembling, but she finally nodded. Okay, what do we do?" Lena glanced around the chamber, her mind racing. "We need to get back to the altar. That's where it started. It has to end there." Samantha looked like she wanted to protest, but another screech silenced her. The creature was moving faster now, its steps echoing like a drumbeat. "Let's go," Lena said, gripping Samantha's arm and pulling her toward the tunnel that led back to the bone chamber. The journey back was slower this time, every shadow and sound threatening to send them into a panic. The tunnel seemed narrower, the air colder, as though the cave itself were working against them. Lena's flashlight flickered again, the light dimming with every step. Finally, they reached the chamber. The sight of the altar sent a chill down Lena's spine. The bones around it seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly glow, as if responding to the creature's presence. Samantha hung back, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows. "Now what?" she whispered. Lena didn't answer. She was already moving toward the altar, scanning the carvings for anything she might have missed. The symbols glowed faintly, their meaning just out of reach. She knelt beside the altar, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. The carvings depicted flames engulfing the bones, but there was something else, something small and metallic, held by the figure in the image. "The key," Lena muttered, her eyes widening. "What key?" Samantha asked, her voice tight with fear. Before Lena could explain, the creature's screech pierced the air, louder than ever. It was here. Lena spun around, her heart pounding. The bone collector stood at the edge of the chamber, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Its skeletal frame seemed to expand and contract with each breath, the bones clinking softly as it moved. The creature tilted its head, its gaze shifting to the altar. For a moment, Lena thought she saw a flicker of recognition or anger in its glowing eyes. "It doesn't want us near the altar," Lena whispered. Samantha stared at her, wide-eyed. "What does that mean?" "It means we're on the right track," Lena said, her voice trembling. She turned back to the altar, her mind racing. The creature wouldn't let them complete the ritual, not without a fight. Lena's flashlight flickered again, then went out entirely, plunging the chamber into darkness. Samantha let out a muffled scream and Lena's stomach twisted. The only light now came from the faint glow of the altar and the creature's eyes, which seemed to burn brighter in the darkness. "Stay close to me," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Samantha didn't respond, but Lena could hear her breathing, shallow and rapid, just behind her. The creature took a step forward, its bones clinking softly. Lena could feel the weight of its gaze, its presence suffocating. It was waiting, toying with them. Lena's mind raced. Fire. They needed fire. But how? There was nothing in the cave that could burn, nothing to ignite. Unless... Her eyes fell on the pile of bones surrounding the altar. The carvings had shown flames consuming them. Could they burn? Could they destroy the creature's power? She had to try. "Samantha," Lena said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Help me pile the bones on the altar." "What?" Samantha hissed, her voice sharp with panic. "Are you crazy?" "Just do it," Lena snapped. "Trust me." Samantha hesitated, but the sound of the creature's slow, deliberate footsteps spurred her into action. Together, they began dragging the bones toward the altar, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The bones were cold and brittle, their weight heavier than Lena expected. The creature screeched again, the sound filling the chamber like a physical force. It was closer now, its skeletal frame looming in the dim light. Lena worked faster, her fingers trembling as she piled the last of the bones onto the altar. She could feel the creature's presence behind her, could hear the clinking of its bones as it moved. She turned to Samantha, her eyes desperate. "Do you have a lighter? Anything?" Samantha fumbled through her pockets, her hands shaking. I don't..." She stopped, her fingers closing around a small object. A lighter. "Here." Samantha thrust it toward Lena, her face pale. Lena grabbed it, her heart racing. She flicked the wheel, the small flame sputtering to life. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She pressed the flame to the pile of bones, her breath catching as the fire began to spread. The bones crackled and hissed, the glow from the altar intensifying. The creature let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing as the flames grew. It lunged toward them, its skeletal hands outstretched, but the fire seemed to repel it, forcing it back. Lena stepped closer to the altar, shielding Samantha with her body. The fire consumed the bones, the flames reaching higher and higher, until the entire chamber was bathed in an orange glow. The creature let out one final ear-splitting scream, its glowing eyes dimming as its body crumbled. The bones that adorned it fell to the ground, shattering into ash, and then silence. The fire burned low, the light fading as the last of the bones turned to dust. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and Lena felt her chest loosen for the first time since they'd entered the cave. She turned to Samantha, who was staring at the altar in disbelief. "Is it over?" Samantha whispered. Lena didn't answer. She didn't know. But the cave was still now, and for the first time, Lena allowed herself to hope. The flickering flames on the altar cast long shadows across the chamber walls, their warmth slowly dissipating into the frigid air. Lena stared at the pile of ash where the bone collector had once stood. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing, but the stillness of the room felt wrong. It was too quiet. "Is it gone?" Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. She hadn't moved from where she crouched by the wall, her wide eyes fixed on the smoldering altar. Lena shook her head, unwilling to let herself believe they were safe. The bone collector was gone, but the air in the cave still felt heavy, oppressive. The carvings on the altar had dimmed, but the strange, twisting patterns still seemed alive, as if watching them. "We need to get out of here," Lena said, her voice firm. "Now." Samantha nodded quickly, scrambling to her feet. The fear in her eyes mirrored Lena's own. The two of them turned toward the tunnel, their footsteps echoing through the chamber as they moved with as much speed as they dared. The darkness around them felt thicker now, the light from Lena's flashlight barely piercing the shadows. As they retraced their steps, the silence was broken only by their ragged breathing and the soft crunch of their boots on the rocky ground. But then, faintly at first, Lena heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. Scraping. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Bone against stone. Lena froze in her tracks, her flashlight trembling in her grip. Samantha stopped beside her, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" Lena nodded slowly, her pulse quickening. The sound was getting louder, echoing through the tunnels, like a cruel reminder. "But we destroyed it," Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. "The fire, it should have worked." Lena's mind raced. The carvings on the altar had shown the bones burning, the spirals consumed by flames. They had done everything the ritual depicted. So why wasn't it over? The scraping sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was no longer coming from behind them. It was ahead. Lena's stomach turned as a realization settled over her like ice. "It's not gone," she said softly. "It's the cave. It's part of this place." Samantha stared at her, panic flashing across her face. "What are you saying, that we're trapped here?" "I don't know," Lena admitted, her voice cracking. "But we can't stop. We have to keep moving." They pressed on, their pace quickening despite the weight of exhaustion dragging at their limbs. The tunnels twisted and turned, each one leading into another indistinguishable corridor. It was impossible to tell if they were heading in the right direction or deeper into the labyrinth. "Do you think the others?" Samantha started, but her voice trailed off, the unspoken question hanging heavily in the air. Lena didn't answer. She didn't want to think about Jake or Tom or Lila. The thought of what might have happened to them, the screams, the silence that followed, was too much. But then they turned a corner, and the tunnel opened into another chamber. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The walls were covered in markings, far more elaborate than any they had seen before. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. Bones were piled high in the corners, and in the center of the room stood a tall, jagged obelisk made of black stone. "What is this place?" Samantha asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lena approached the obelisk cautiously, her flashlight casting long shadows across its surface. The stone was smooth and cold, but it seemed to hum with an energy that made her skin crawl. Carved into the base of the obelisk were more symbols, but these were different. They weren't just patterns, they were words. Lena squinted, the unfamiliar shapes twisting before her eyes. But as she stared, the meaning became clear, as if the symbols were speaking directly to her. To sever the bond, a life must be given. Her breath hitched. She stumbled back from the obelisk, shaking her head. "What is it?" Samantha asked, her voice tinged with fear. Lena looked at her, the words catching in her throat. "The bond, it's not broken yet. The ritual wasn't complete." Samantha frowned. "What do you mean?" "We burned the bones. A life must be given," Lena said, her voice hollow. The words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Samantha's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. No, that's not fair. We didn't know." A low growl echoed through the chamber, cutting her off. Lena's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as the sound grew louder. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the cave pressing down on them like a physical force. It was here. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, twisting and coiling like living things. The scraping sound returned louder now, and Lena's heart sank as she saw the figure emerging from the darkness. The bone collector was whole again. Its skeletal frame gleamed in the dim light, its glowing eyes fixed on them with an unrelenting hunger. The bones it wore seemed to shift and rattle, as though alive. Samantha let out a strangled cry, backing away until she hit the wall. "It can't be back. It can't." Lena stepped in front of her, her body trembling. "Run," she said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "What?" Samantha's eyes widened. "Run," Lena repeated, her gaze locked on the creature. "I'll distract it." "Go." Samantha hesitated, tears streaming down her face. But another growl from the creature spurred her into action. She turned and bolted toward the nearest tunnel, her footsteps echoing through the chamber. The bone collector didn't move. Its glowing eyes stayed fixed on Lena, its skeletal hands twitching as if savoring the moment. Lena gripped the flashlight tightly, her mind racing. She didn't know what she could do, how she could fight something that wasn't truly alive. But if the obelisk was the key, if it could sever the bond. The creature lunged. Lena dove to the side, the flashlight slipping from her grasp as the bone collector's claws raked against the stone where she had been standing. The impact sent a shower of sparks into the air, illuminating the chamber in brief, terrifying flashes. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting to the obelisk. It was the only chance she had. The creature turned toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. It wasn't in a hurry. It knew there was nowhere for her to run. Lena's hands found a jagged rock on the ground, and without thinking, she hurled it at the creature. It shattered against its skeletal frame, the shards clattering uselessly to the floor. But the distraction was enough. She sprinted toward the obelisk, her heart pounding in her chest. The symbols glowed brighter as she approached, the energy radiating from the stone making her skin prickle. The bone collector screeched, the sound piercing and unrelenting. Lena didn't stop. She reached the obelisk and placed her hands on its surface, the cold stone sending a shock through her body. To sever the bond, a life must be given. She closed her eyes, her breath coming in short gasps. "Take me," she whispered. "Just take me and end this." The chamber seemed to tremble as Lena's whispered words hung in the air. Her hands gripped the cold surface of the obelisk, its pulsating energy coursing through her veins. The bone collector paused mid-step, its skeletal form looming over her, glowing eyes fixed on her with a mixture of hunger and curiosity. Lena's voice wavered, but her resolve held firm. "Take me," she repeated, her words echoing in the stillness. Just let her go. Let them all go. The bone collector tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement that made Lena's stomach twist. It took another step closer, its bony hands twitching with anticipation. The room felt impossibly small now, the walls pressing inward as the creature loomed over her. Lena's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the symbols on the obelisk flared to life. The carvings glowed brighter, the pulsating rhythm matching the erratic beat of her heart. The cave itself seemed to respond, the air growing colder, heavier, as if the chamber were holding its breath. Behind her, a faint voice broke through the oppressive silence. "Lena, no!" She turned her head sharply, her heart skipping a beat. Samantha stood at the edge of the chamber, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her flashlight shook in her trembling hands. "Get out of here, Samantha," Lena shouted, her voice cracking. "It's the only way." "No!" Samantha screamed, stepping forward despite the fear etched across her face. "There has to be another way." "You can't." The bone collector screeched, the sound so loud and piercing that it forced Samantha to stumble backward. The creature's glowing eyes shifted toward her, its skeletal form tensing like a predator preparing to strike. Lena acted on instinct. "No!" she yelled, slamming her hands against the obelisk. "It's me you want!" The creature's head snapped back toward Lena, its hollow gaze locking onto her once more. The air around them seemed to vibrate, the glowing symbols on the obelisk flaring brighter as the energy within it surged. Pain shot through Lena's body, sharp and electric, as the obelisk's energy flowed into her. Her vision blurred, her knees buckling as the symbols burned brighter. She could feel the weight of the bone collector's gaze, its presence pressing down on her like a physical force. And then, it moved. The bone collector lunged, its skeletal hand outstretched, but it stopped just short of her. The symbols on the obelisk flared in response, a barrier of light erupting between Lena and the creature. The light wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold, harsh, and unrelenting, cutting through the darkness with a searing intensity. The bone collector recoiled, its screech filling the chamber as the light enveloped it. The glow from its eyes flickered, and for the first time Lena saw something in them that wasn't hunger or malice. Fear. The obelisk pulsed again, and the light expanded, reaching out to the bones that littered the chamber. The spirals began to glow, their intricate patterns burning with the same harsh light as the obelisk. The bones cracked and splintered, the air filling with the sound of shattering fragments. The bone collector let out one final ear-splitting scream as its form began to disintegrate. The bones that adorned its body fell away, turning to ash before they hit the ground. Its glowing eyes dimmed, the hollow orbs shrinking until they were nothing more than faint pinpricks of light. Lena's body trembled as the energy from the obelisk surged through her, the pain intensifying. She could feel it, something ancient and powerful pulling at her, as if the cave itself were trying to claim her. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. "Lena." Samantha's voice cut through the haze, desperate and frantic. "You have to stop." Lena gritted her teeth, her hands clenching the edges of the obelisk. "I can't," she said through ragged breaths. "It's the only way." "No." Samantha ran forward, grabbing Lena's arm. "You're not doing this alone. We'll find another way." The light from the obelisk flared again, forcing Samantha to shield her eyes. The symbols on its surface shifted, their patterns twisting into something new, something Lena couldn't understand. The cave shuddered violently, the walls groaning as cracks spiderwebbed across the stone. Rocks tumbled from the ceiling, and a deafening roar filled the air as the chamber began to collapse. "Lena, we have to go!" Samantha shouted, pulling at her arm. "It's over." Lena hesitated, her grip on the obelisk faltering. The energy within it was fading now, the light dimming as the symbols burned themselves out. The bone collector was gone, its presence erased from the chamber, but the cost of the ritual was clear. The cave was collapsing, and if they didn't leave now, they would be buried with it. She let go. The sudden release sent a shock through her body, and she stumbled backward, barely catching herself before she fell. Samantha grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the nearest tunnel as the chamber continued to shake. They ran. The tunnels twisted and turned, the collapsing walls closing in around them. Lena's legs burned, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps, but she didn't stop. Samantha's grip on her arm was the only thing keeping her grounded, the only thing pulling her toward the faint hope of escape. Finally, They saw it, a faint sliver of light ahead, growing brighter with every step. The cave's entrance. Freedom. They burst out into the open air just as the ground behind them gave way, the cave collapsing in on itself with a deafening roar. Dust and debris filled the air, and the two of them fell to their knees, coughing and gasping for breath. Lena stared at the ruins of the cave, her body trembling. The oppressive weight that had hung over her since they'd entered was gone, replaced by an aching emptiness. "It's over," Samantha said softly, her voice raw. "It's finally over." Lena didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the rubble, her mind racing with the events of the last few hours. The bone collector was gone. The cave was destroyed. But the words carved into the obelisk still echoed in her mind. A life must be given. She turned to Samantha, her voice barely above a whisper. "We made it out." Samantha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yeah, we did." But as Lena looked at the ruins again, a chill ran down her spine. The ground beneath the rubble was unnaturally still, as if the cave was holding its breath. And then faintly, she heard it, a single distant scrape of bone against stone. The distant scrape of bone against stone sent a shiver down Lena's spine. She sat frozen on the rocky ground outside the collapsed cave, her body trembling with exhaustion. Samantha's ragged breathing was the only sound breaking the stillness, but even that seemed distant, muffled, as if the air itself were holding its breath. "It's gone," Samantha murmured, her voice fragile. "It has to be gone." Lena didn't respond. She wanted to believe those words, but the faint scrape, so soft it could have been her imagination, lingered in her ears, refusing to fade. She stared at the pile of rubble that had been the cave, watching as the dust settled and the first rays of dawn pierced through the trees. The bone collector was gone. The cave was destroyed. They had survived. So why couldn't she shake the feeling that it wasn't over? Samantha shifted beside her, her hand brushing against Lena's arm. "We need to get help. The others, Jake, Tom, Lila, they..." Her voice cracked, and she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Lena closed her eyes, her chest tightening. The others were gone. She had known it the moment they'd heard the screams in the tunnels, the awful silence that followed. She'd failed them. She'd failed all of them. "Lena," Samantha said softly, her voice trembling, "we need to go." Lena nodded, her movements mechanical as she forced herself to her feet. Her legs felt like lead, every step a struggle as they began the long trek back to the trailhead. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves absent, as if the world itself was in mourning. They walked in silence, neither of them speaking as the weight of what they'd endured settled over them. Lena couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, the altar, the obelisk, the bone collector's piercing gaze. She had given herself to the ritual, offered her life to sever the bond. So why was she still here? Samantha's voice broke the silence. "What did you mean back there? About a life needing to be given?" Lena hesitated, her throat dry. "The carvings on the obelisk. They said the bond couldn't be broken without a life. I thought..." She swallowed hard, her voice faltering. "I thought it would be mine." Samantha glanced at her, her eyes wide. "But you're still here." "I know," Lena said quietly, her gaze fixed on the ground. "That's what I don't understand." The words hung between them, heavy and unresolved. Samantha didn't press further, and Lena was grateful for the silence that followed. But her thoughts continued to churn, the unanswered question gnawing at her. They reached the trailhead just as the sun began to climb higher in the sky. The familiar sight of the dirt path and the parked car should have brought relief, but Lena felt none. The forest still seemed wrong, the air too still, too quiet. Samantha opened the car door, her movement slow and deliberate, and slid into the passenger seat. Lena hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting back toward the woods. The shadows beneath the trees seemed darker than they should have been, shifting faintly as if something moved within them. She shook her head, forcing herself to turn away. It was over. It had to be. The drive back to town was a blur, the silence between them broken only by the hum of the engine. Samantha stared out the window, her expression distant, while Lena gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The road stretched endlessly before them, the weight of their ordeal pressing down on every mile. When they finally reached the outskirts of town, Samantha spoke, her voice barely audible. "Do you think we'll ever be okay?" Lena didn't answer right away. She didn't know how to answer. The scars of what they'd been through, what they'd lost, weren't the kind that healed easily, if they ever healed at all. "I don't know," Lena admitted, her voice heavy. "But we're alive. That's all we can hold on to for now." Samantha nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yeah, I guess you're right." They drove in silence the rest of the way, the weight of their shared trauma settling between them like a physical presence. When Lena finally pulled into the driveway of Samantha's apartment, the morning sun was high in the sky. Samantha hesitated before getting out, her hand lingering on the door handle. "Lena," she said softly, turning to face her, "thank you for everything, for saving me." Lena managed a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just take care of yourself, okay?" Samantha nodded, her expression earnest. "You too." Lena watched as Samantha disappeared into the building, her heart heavy. She wanted to believe that they were safe now, that the nightmare was truly over. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the bond hadn't been fully severed. She drove home in a haze, the events of the past hours playing on a loop in her mind. When she finally stepped through the door of her small apartment, the weight of exhaustion hit her like a tidal wave. She dropped her backpack by the door and sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. It was over. It had to be. But then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from her backpack, a soft scraping, like bone against stone. Lena froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she turned her head toward the bag, dread pooling in her stomach. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was inside was alive. Trembling, Lena reached for the bag, her fingers hesitating before unzipping it. Inside, nestled among her belongings, was a single bone. Small, smooth, and pale, it seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the apartment. Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of realization hit her. The bond hadn't been broken. The bone collector wasn't gone. It was inside her. The scraping sound grew louder, echoing in her mind, and Lena's vision blurred as a cold, hollow voice whispered in her ear. "You thought it was over, but it's only just begun." Hope you liked the first story. Now let's start the second. The old house stood at the edge of town, its white paint long faded to a weary shade of gray. With ivy climbing up the weathered walls and moss creeping over the cobblestone driveway, it looked like something out of an old photograph. Yet to Emma, standing at the threshold with a suitcase in one hand and Jack's hand in the other, it felt like the start of something new, a fresh beginning. "We're really doing this, huh?" Jack's voice was a quiet murmur beside her. Emma glanced up at him, her lips curving into a soft smile. Jack's voice always had a grounding effect on her, especially now, when the excitement of the move mixed with the tension of the unknown. "Of course we are. Look at it. It's perfect for us." The house had come up almost by chance. Emma had found it during a late-night online search, hidden deep in the listings of an obscure real estate site. At first, it seemed like a distant dream, far too affordable for something with so much potential. But when she showed Jack, he was surprisingly on board. He'd always been the more practical one, but even he couldn't deny the charm of the house, tucked away in a quiet, secluded town. The promise of escape from their busy city lives was too tempting. The air around them was cool and crisp as they made their way through the gate, the overgrown garden rustling in the breeze. Jack dragged the last of the boxes from the car, while Emma made her way to the front door, her hand brushing the worn brass handle. "This place definitely needs some love," she muttered, noting the peeling paint on the front steps and the cracked window panes. But despite the wear and tear, there was something warm about it, something that made her feel like she belonged here. Stepping inside, the house greeted them with an odd mix of quiet solitude and a lingering sense of abandonment. The air smelled faintly of old wood and dust, with a hint of something musty like it had been waiting for them. The tall ceilings and large windows let in the soft afternoon light, casting a gentle glow on the hardwood floors, which creaked under their feet. "Not bad for an old place," Jack said, setting the boxes down in the entryway. He looked around, his eyes scanning the living room. A little cleaning up, maybe some paint, and this place could be amazing. "Exactly," Emma replied. "It's perfect." As she stepped deeper into the house, a slight shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the draft running through the hallways or the soft creaking of the wooden beams above, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. Nothing specific, nothing concrete, just a sense that the house was watching them, waiting. But it was fleeting, a passing thought she quickly dismissed. Jack, too, seemed unbothered, moving on with his usual practicality. They wandered through the house, making plans for where to put furniture, where to place the bookshelves, and where to hang the framed photos from their old apartment. It felt almost like a game, exploring every nook and cranny, trying to decide which room would be theirs. The upstairs was just as charming, though slightly more dilapidated. The wallpaper was faded and the floors creaked underfoot, but the rooms had character. Large windows that looked out over the garden and old fireplaces in nearly every room. The master bedroom had a large bay window that faced the front of the house. From it, Emma could see the sprawling garden, overgrown, wild, and in need of attention, but beautiful nonetheless. It seemed to stretch on forever, reaching into the woods beyond. A sense of calm washed over her as she stared out the window. "This is it," she whispered to herself, a smile spreading across her face. "This is where we're going to start our new life." Emma's voice broke the silence, and she turned to Jack, who had been inspecting the cracked ceiling in the corner of the room. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Isn't it perfect?" Jack gave a half-hearted nod. "Yeah, it's definitely got character," he said, though his tone was a little distant. Emma didn't notice. She was too wrapped up in the excitement of their new life to think anything of it. Little did she know, the house had already begun to make its presence known, though not in ways they would understand just yet. The days passed quickly. Jack spent his mornings organizing the garage and starting minor repairs while Emma unpacked boxes and began to imagine how they could breathe new life into the rooms. The air outside had turned colder, the first hints of autumn creeping in as the leaves in the garden began to turn golden and brown. Every evening, they'd settle in with tea or wine, enjoying the quiet that the house offered. But it didn't take long before Emma started noticing things, small, insignificant details that seemed just a little off. One afternoon, as she carried a stack of books into the living room, she paused in the doorway, blinking at the sight in front of her. The heavy wooden door that separated the living room from the hallway was wide open. It had been closed when she left. She frowned and stepped closer, her heart beginning to beat just a little faster. She could have sworn she'd closed it before she left. Jack, of course, would insist she hadn't. He was always the practical one, the one who believed that there was always a logical explanation for everything. "Jack?" she called, her voice trailing off as she stepped inside. He was in the kitchen, his back turned to her as he unpacked another box of dishes. She shook her head, a little embarrassed. It was probably nothing. She was just being paranoid. Still, the door's position unsettled her. She closed it with a soft click and went about her work, trying to push the unease out of her mind. Later that evening, after dinner, They decided to go for a walk around the property. The air had become chillier, and the wind rattled the branches of the trees, sending the last few leaves fluttering to the ground. As they strolled down the uneven path that cut through the garden, Emma couldn't help but feel a growing sense of tension in the air. It was hard to put her finger on, but something was different about this place. The silence in the house wasn't normal. It was almost too quiet. Jack was talking about the repairs he planned for the garage, but Emma wasn't really listening. Her attention kept drifting toward the house, where the windows seemed to stare back at her, dark and unblinking. "Emma," Jack's voice cut through her thoughts. "You okay?" "Yeah, just thinking," she said, forcing a smile. She couldn't explain it to him, not without sounding ridiculous. It was just the house, she told herself. Old houses made odd noises. It was nothing to be concerned about. But the next morning, things took a stranger turn. Emma woke up early, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. The house was still and silent, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax. But as she slipped out of bed and made her way to the bathroom, she noticed something else, something that made her stop in her tracks. The hallway light was on. She frowned, standing at the threshold of the bathroom and staring down the narrow corridor. The light should have been off. She was sure she had turned it off the night before, but here it was, glowing faintly at the end of the hall. The bulb flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows against the walls. "Jack?" she called softly, but there was no answer. She walked down the hall cautiously, her footsteps muffled on the carpeted floor. The air felt heavier now, more oppressive, like the house itself was pressing in on her. As she reached for the light switch, she hesitated. A part of her expected something to be standing in the dark, waiting. But there was nothing. The light flickered again before she switched it off. She stood there for a moment, her heart racing before shaking her head. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. It wasn't until she returned to the kitchen to find Jack standing by the coffee pot, his face scrunched in confusion, that she realized something else was wrong. "Did you move the chair in the living room?" Jack asked, his brow furrowing as he gestured toward the far corner of the room. Emma blinked, her mind racing. The chair? No, she hadn't moved it. She hadn't even been in the living room yet this morning. "What do you mean?" she asked, though her voice felt distant, as though she were disconnected from the moment. It's not where I left it," Jack said, walking toward the living room. "It was right here." He pointed to the space by the window. The chair was now several feet away, angled toward the bookshelf. Emma swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. I didn't move it." Jack turned back to her with a slight smile, though it seemed more forced than usual. "You sure? It's no big deal. Maybe we just—" "Jack, I swear I didn't touch it," Emma interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. Jack sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Okay. Maybe you did it in your sleep. It's an old house, things shift." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the house settling. The air felt thick now, like something was hidden just beneath the surface. She kept the thoughts to herself, not wanting to start an argument, but deep down, she couldn't help but feel that they were being watched. The days that followed were filled with more subtle oddities, doors opening on their own, objects out of place, shadows that didn't quite move the way they should have. The house had begun to feel less like a home and more like a place where something else was waiting for them. And Emma, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't simply old. It was alive. The house grew colder as the days went on, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in the walls. The drafts seemed to come from nowhere, weaving their way through the house with a coldness that made her skin prickle. At night, the silence became unbearable. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet they'd imagined when they first moved in. It was an oppressive, almost suffocating stillness, as though the house was holding its breath. One night, Emma was sitting on the couch, trying to focus on the book in her hands, but her eyes kept wandering toward the hallway. The soft creak of floorboards echoed through the stillness, and she found herself looking up, listening intently. Nothing. Her fingers tightened around the spine of the book and she tried to refocus, but then the whispering started. It was faint at first, like a soft murmur just beyond the edge of her hearing. She blinked, straining to catch the words. Was someone talking in the other room? Her gaze flicked toward the hallway again, but no one was there. Jack was upstairs taking a call about some work project he'd been trying to wrap up. Emma stood up, her heart pounding a little faster. The whispering grew louder, a rhythmic rustling like words being spoken too softly to understand. It seemed to come from the walls. No, not just the walls. The very air around her felt thick with it. She moved toward the hallway, each step heavier than the last. The house felt alive again, but not in the welcoming, familiar way it had before. This was something darker, something insistent. She stopped just outside the living room, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorframe. Jack. Her voice cracked in the silence, though she knew he couldn't hear her. She'd just spoken, but the whispers were louder now, almost as if they were coming from all directions. Emma. Her name, clear as day. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Had she heard it? No, she couldn't have. It wasn't possible. Jack had been the skeptic from the beginning, brushing off her growing concerns about the house. He always had a logical explanation for everything, from the doors moving on their own to the odd noises in the walls. But this wasn't something that could be explained. Emma. The whisper came again, a hushed, raspy breath. The walls seemed to close in, the air pressing down on her chest. She stepped backward, her legs shaky. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. Emma stood motionless in the hall, a chill crawling up her spine as she strained to hear anything else. But there was only silence now, the kind that rang too loudly in her ears. It was as if the house had paused, waiting for her to respond, waiting for something. She wanted to call out to Jack to tell him what she'd heard, but something held her back. Instead, she slowly retreated into the living room, her mind racing. The walls had whispered to her. It was impossible, irrational, but she knew what she had heard. She couldn't shake it. Later that night, after Jack had gone to bed, Emma stayed awake. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the whisper still echoing in her mind. What had it been? Was it the house settling? A draft causing an eerie sound? No, she knew better. It was too real. And then, in the quiet of the night, she heard it again. This time it was closer. A faint whisper, so soft she could barely catch it. Emma! She jolted upright in bed, her pulse racing. She strained to listen, her breath shallow in the dark. The house felt alive again, pulsing with some dark energy, like it was trying to reach out to her. It was only then that she realized she hadn't heard anything when Jack was in the room. She hadn't heard anything during the day, only at night, only when the house was still. A sudden irrational fear crept over her, and she rushed out of bed, her bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floor. She didn't know why, but she needed to check the attic. The attic, where she'd seen that strange, unsettling family portrait of the Hawthorns, the couple who had lived here before them. She had been avoiding the attic, telling herself it was too dusty or that they didn't need to bother with it yet. But tonight, something tugged at her. The whisper had started when she had stood in the hall, near the stairs that led up to it. Was it a sign? A warning? Emma reached the top of the stairs and stood in the dark, the air growing colder as she approached the attic door. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she gripped the brass knob. The door creaked open, the sound reverberating through the silence of the house. The attic was exactly how she remembered it, a dark, musty space full of forgotten things. Old furniture, boxes of yellowing books, and cobwebs in the corners. The only light came from the thin beam of moonlight that filtered through the small attic window. There, in the far corner, was the box. The one she hadn't dared to open yet. She walked toward it, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. As her fingers brushed the dust-covered lid, she hesitated, but the pull was too strong, too compelling. She opened the box. Inside was an assortment of things. Old photographs, papers, and letters tied together with a frayed piece of twine. And at the very bottom, beneath the papers, was a small, leather-bound diary. Her breath caught as she lifted it, feeling the cool, cracked cover beneath her fingertips. It seemed so familiar. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it, as though it were meant for her. The moment her fingers brushed against the cover, the whispering started again, louder than before. Emma. She gasped, her heart racing in her chest. The voice was so close now, so real. She had to know what was inside. She had to understand. Without thinking, Emma opened the diary, and the room seemed to grow colder still, the air thickening around her. Emma's hands trembled as she turned the fragile pages of the diary. The leather cover was cracked with age, its edges frayed and worn. But the pages inside were remarkably well preserved, despite the dust and cobwebs. The ink was still dark, though the handwriting was uneven and shaky, like the writer had been losing control of their thoughts. The first entry was dated almost 30 years ago, the year the Hawthorns had moved into the house. January 18th, 1955. It feels like we've been here for years already, though it's only been a few weeks. The house is strange, so full of history. Every room, every corner, seems to have a memory of its own. I can hear things at night, footsteps in the halls, whispers in the walls. I've asked Thomas if he hears them too, but he only shakes his head. Says it's the house settling, just old wood and old pipes. But I know better. There's something here. I can feel it. Emma swallowed, the words sending an eerie chill through her. She looked around the attic, her gaze flicking nervously to the shadows. The whispers from earlier seemed to linger in the air, a faint rustling just on the edge of her hearing. She flipped to the next page, her curiosity growing despite the creeping sense of dread. February 2nd, 1955. Thomas has started to change. I can see it in his eyes. He doesn't sleep like he used to. He's always awake, wandering the halls at night, muttering to himself. I thought at first it was just stress, but now I wonder. Sometimes when I wake up, I can hear him talking to someone, but he's alone. I've asked him if something is wrong, if he's feeling unwell, but he just tells me it's nothing, that the house has been making him restless. Restless? No. This is more than that. A shiver ran down Emma's spine. She could feel the weight of the words in the room, as if the house itself was listening, waiting for her to read more. She couldn't stop now. She turned the page. March 12th, 1955. I found Thomas in the attic today, staring at the wall, as though he were waiting for something. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he was listening, but he wouldn't tell me what. He hasn't spoken to me much since then. I think he's afraid of me. I think he's afraid of the house. But I know he doesn't want to admit it. I found something today. A photograph, an old family portrait, hidden in the wall of the study. The faces, they seem so familiar, but I don't know why. They look like they're watching me, like they're waiting for me to join them. The entry was abruptly cut off. The last sentence trailed into smudged ink, as if the writer had been interrupted or perhaps had stopped writing mid-thought. Emma's fingers lingered on the page. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel a pull inside her chest, something compelling her to keep reading, to understand what had happened to Thomas and his wife. But the next page was different. The writing was frantic, erratic, as if the writer had lost all control. April 5th, 1955. It's in the walls. It's in the house. I can feel it moving beneath the floorboards, crawling in the dark. It whispers to me when I'm alone. It's making me do things. I tried to leave. I tried to leave the house, but I can't. The door won't open. The walls close in. I can't escape it. I think it wants me. It's watching me. Watching us. Watching her. The final words were scrawled across the bottom of the page in a jagged hand, as if the writer had been desperate to finish. Emma flipped through the next few pages, but the entries were all the same. More frantic scribbles, more mentions of whispers, more references to the house itself. As the entries grew more erratic, the words became harder to read, and the ink began to bleed into the paper, leaving dark blotches that made the diary nearly impossible to decipher. The last entry was dated July 13th, 1955, and it was the most disturbing of all. July 13th, 1955. It wants me. It wants my soul. It's already taken her. I can feel her here in the walls, in the air. She's gone, and soon I'll be too. But I won't go quietly. I won't let it take me without a fight. It's too late. It's already inside me. The page was almost completely black, as if the ink had bled through the entire sheet. Emma's hands trembled, the diary falling from her grip and landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor. Her heart raced, the words echoing in her mind like a chant. The house had claimed Thomas, and it had claimed his wife. Was it the same thing that had been calling to her, whispering her name in the dark? Was it already too late for her too? No. She had to stay calm. She had to understand what was happening. But before she could gather her thoughts, a sound behind her froze her in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps. She turned toward the attic stairs. Her breath caught in her throat. She had heard the footsteps the night she arrived, hadn't she? And now they were back. Emma stood motionless, her body locked in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing from the dark stairwell, but there was no one there. She was alone. At least, she thought she was. The footsteps stopped just before they reached the attic door, and Emma felt a chill crawl down her spine. Was someone watching her from the shadows, waiting for her to move? She stood there frozen, as the air around her seemed to grow colder still. The footsteps stopped, but the air didn't return to normal. Instead, it thickened as though something unseen was pressing in from all sides, holding Emma in place. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest, and she stood frozen in the attic, her eyes scanning the dark stairwell for any movement. But there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, only silence. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her, amplified by the unsettling diary and the strange growing sense of dread that had consumed her since they moved in. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there, watching her. She turned back to the diary, the pages now open before her. But it didn't matter. Her attention was pulled elsewhere. The shadows in the corners of the attic had shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but there was something new, a small indentation in the wall near the far corner, just to the left of the window. She hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't much, a barely noticeable groove in the wood, but it caught her eye. And then, as if it were meant to be seen, the wall seemed to shift, the indentation growing wider, the wood groaning faintly in protest. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The attic was full of old furniture and forgotten things, but this wasn't right. The walls weren't supposed to move. The house wasn't supposed to reveal new secrets like this. Her legs moved before her brain could fully process what was happening. She crossed the dusty floor, her hands trembling as she reached for the edge of the wall. She pressed against it, and a sudden, sharp sound echoed through the room, like the click of a lock turning. The wall shifted inward. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, Emma stepped back, watching as the hidden door began to open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passageway. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faintest smell of mildew and decay wafted out from the gap. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. What was this? A hidden room? A secret passage? The whispers returned, fainter now, but unmistakable. They were in the walls, She could hear them clearer than ever before. Emma. It was her name. Soft, calling to her from the darkness beyond the door. She stood there frozen for a moment, the darkness ahead seeming to pull her in, as if something deep within the house was summoning her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the attic, to leave the house, to go anywhere but here. But her feet were planted firmly to the ground, her gaze fixed on the opening before her. Slowly, she reached out, her hand shaking as it hovered near the doorway. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, but her body moved on its own. One step, then another. She stepped inside the passageway. The air grew colder as she moved deeper, the narrow space almost suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around her, the dim light from the attic fading as she descended. She could still hear the whispers growing louder with every step she took. "It wants you, Emma." She squeezed her eyes shut, but the words followed her, vibrating through her bones. There was something alive in the walls, something ancient and insistent. It had been here long before she and Jack arrived, and it was calling her now, leading her deeper into the heart of the house. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The passageway opened up into a small hidden room, so small it could barely be called a room at all. The space was cramped, with low ceilings and narrow walls. It was filled with old crates and boxes, some broken and others still sealed, as though they had been left untouched for decades. The air was thick, damp with the musty smell of decay. But what caught Emma's eye, what made her heart drop into her stomach, was the thing that lay at the center of the room. A small, weathered chest, its surface carved with strange, swirling patterns. It looked old, ancient even, but the carvings on it were unlike anything she had seen before. The chest was made of dark wood, and its brass hinges gleamed faintly in the dim light. Something about it felt wrong, too inviting, too familiar. It was as if it had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to open it. Her breath caught in her throat as her hand hovered over the lid. Her fingers trembled uncontrollably, the feeling of dread and anticipation so intense that it almost paralyzed her. Before she could stop herself, she lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of old, faded clothes. But as her fingers brushed against the fabric, her stomach lurched. Beneath the clothes, something hard and cold pressed against her fingertips. A small, tarnished key. It was nothing special, just an old, rusted key, but it felt heavy in her hand, like it carried the weight of something far greater than its size, something ancient. The moment she touched it, the air around her seemed to shift. The walls groaned, and the temperature in the room dropped, sending a chill through her bones. She turned, her heart racing, her breath shallow. Something was wrong. The whispers were gone, but something else had taken their place. A faint rustling, as though something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. Emma's eyes darted to the far corner of the room where the darkness seemed thicker than it should have been. She felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air, a sudden pressure. And then a pair of glowing eyes stared back at her from the corner, its yellowed irises gleaming in the dim light. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward, its limbs impossibly long, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The look in its eyes, the hunger, the malice, told her everything she needed to know. She wasn't alone anymore. The figure didn't move any closer, but the air grew heavier, thicker, as if it was waiting for her to make the first move. Emma could barely breathe, her body frozen in place. She could feel the weight of its gaze, like the walls were closing in, and she knew. She had to get out of there. Time seemed to stretch, pulling taut like an elastic band ready to snap. Emma's body was frozen, caught between the fear clawing at her chest and the paralyzing urge to flee. The figure in the corner did not advance, but neither did it disappear. Its eyes, unblinking and unfeeling, bore into her soul, and for a long moment, she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The air was thick, like the very atmosphere had grown heavier, suffocating her with its oppressive weight. The figure took a single, deliberate step forward. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin stretched too tight over a thin frame that seemed almost skeletal. The thing's face was hollow, gaunt, with sharp, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. It had no mouth, no nose, just those empty, hungry eyes. The skin was an eerie ashen color, as though it had been drained of life. It can't be real, Emma thought, trying to steady her racing heart. It's just a trick. The shadows are playing with me. This is just the house. It's just the house. But deep down, she knew the truth. The house was not the problem. Whatever was standing in front of her was not a figment of her imagination. It was real. And it was waiting for her. Her fingers tightened around the key in her hand, the small cold object giving her the strength to break free from her paralysis. She took a cautious step backward, but the thing's eyes never left her, never blinked. It seemed to be studying her, weighing her every movement, every breath. Her mind was racing. What was it? What did it want from her? Was it connected to the whispers, to the hawthorns? Was it... The thing moved again, this time with a disturbing fluidity, its arms stretching toward her in a slow, deliberate motion. The shadows around it seemed to thicken, coiling like serpents, as if the darkness itself was alive, feeding off the terror that had surged inside her. The moment it reached for her, Emma finally snapped. She bolted. Her legs burned as she ran, not caring if she was tripping over the cluttered crates and boxes in the room. Her only focus was the passageway, the door that had opened when she touched the wall, the way out. She couldn't look back, couldn't afford to slow down, but her instincts told her something was chasing her. Something worse than the thing itself. The narrow passageway was even tighter now, as if the walls were closing in, squeezing her with every step. The darkness clawed at her heels, the shadows seeming to chase her, to stretch and reach for her like hands desperate to pull her back into their embrace. Don't look back, she thought, her breath ragged as she ran through the passage, desperate to escape the claustrophobic tunnel. Just get to the stairs. Her mind was racing, filled with one thought. Get out. Get out before it caught her. The passage ended with a steep, narrow staircase that led up to the attic. Emma didn't hesitate, her feet pounding against the stairs as she scrambled upward, the sound of her movement reverberating through the tight space. She didn't dare look down, didn't dare to see if the thing was following her. She just needed to reach the attic. The door at the top of the stairs was ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling through the crack. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't stop. She threw herself against the door, and it creaked open with a groan, letting her tumble into the attic once more. The attic was still, silent. The shadows that had seemed so alive only moments before were gone. Emma collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Her fingers were white-knuckled around the key, the only tangible thing she had left to hold on to. She didn't know what had just happened, what that thing was, but she knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Her eyes scanned the room, her mind still spinning from the terror of what she had just experienced. The attic looked the same as it had when she first entered, the same as when she had discovered the hidden passage. The boxes, the crates, the eerie stillness. But something was different now. The family portrait, the one she had noticed before, was no longer on the wall. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just gone. It was as if it had never been there at all. The space on the wall was completely empty, as though it had been erased from existence. No, she thought, blinking rapidly. It was there. I saw it. I remember seeing it. Her mind raced as she stood up, her feet shaky beneath her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the house, that the house was now fully aware of her presence, and that whatever was in it, whatever had been waiting, was still watching. She looked back toward the passageway, her eyes scanning the dark stairwell. She half expected the thing to emerge from the shadows at any moment, but nothing stirred. Her pulse hammered in her ears, the silence so heavy it almost suffocated her. She had to leave. She had to find Jack. Emma turned to leave the attic, the key still clutched tightly in her hand. But just as she reached the stairs, she heard something. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. The whispering was back. It was her name. Emma's breath hitched as the whisper echoed through the attic. It wasn't like before. It wasn't the soft, distant murmurs that had seemed like figments of her imagination. This time, it was clear, sharp, intimate, and it came from right behind her. Emma. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but the room was empty. The shadows were still and unmoving. There was no one there. No figure standing in the corner. No presence that could be seen. But the feeling of being watched, of being drawn in, was suffocating. The whisper didn't stop. It was growing louder now, more insistent. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. Inside her head, under her skin, in the walls themselves. Come back. It called softly. Come back to us. Her skin crawled at the words, the air in the room thickening. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want to return to that cursed passageway, to the hidden room or the thing that had nearly claimed her. But it was impossible to ignore. The pull was magnetic. It was as though the house itself was trying to drag her back into its dark heart. Emma backed away from the stairs, her mind racing for a way out. She wasn't sure how long she had been in the attic, but the weight of the house's presence felt heavier than ever before. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was alive, hungry, and it was playing with her, toying with her fear. Her gaze fell to the key in her hand. The tarnished metal felt cold, its weight like a silent reminder of whatever was waiting. But she didn't know what it opened, where it led. It didn't matter now. She couldn't think about that. Not yet. She needed to find Jack. She needed to make him believe her. Her feet carried her back down the stairs, her legs trembling beneath her. Each step felt like an eternity, each creak of the floorboards beneath her echoing through the house like a warning. When she reached the bottom, the air seemed lighter, almost welcoming. But the house wasn't done with her. The silence was unnerving. But then, just as she crossed the threshold of the living room, a figure appeared in the doorway. Jack. He was standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with concern. He had clearly been searching for her. The relief that washed over her was immediate. She wasn't alone anymore. But then the coldness returned. Something wasn't right. Emma. Jack's voice was soft, uncertain. Where have you been? I've been looking for you. She stared at him, trying to gather her thoughts. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him everything. About the whispers, the thing in the attic, the key. But no words came. She couldn't make him understand. How could she? How could she make him believe her when even she wasn't sure what was happening? Her hands shook as she held out the key toward him. Jack, she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. Something's wrong with this place. There's something in the walls. It's watching us. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion, but there was something in his expression that made her stomach twist. He didn't look scared. He didn't look like he'd been searching for her out of concern. He looked distant. Emma, you've been under a lot of stress lately, Jack said slowly, his tone calm but strangely detached. You're imagining things. This house is old. You've been hearing noises, and with everything going on, it's easy to let your mind run wild. She shook her head violently, her chest tightening. No, Jack, it's real. I'm not imagining it. He stepped closer, reaching for her hand. You're exhausted. Come on. Let's sit down. You're not thinking straight. The touch of his hand sent a shiver through her, but not the kind she'd expected. It wasn't comfort she felt. It was cold, alien. His fingers felt wrong, like they didn't belong on her skin. She pulled away, instinctively recoiling. Jack, no, please, you don't understand. Something's wrong with you too. This house, it's changing you. His eyes softened and he reached for her again, but this time, something in his gaze shifted. It wasn't concern anymore. It was something else, something darker, something she couldn't identify. His expression twisted into a half smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. You're being paranoid, Emma, he said, his voice dropping lower, almost a growl. You don't know what you're talking about. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she took a step back, her pulse racing. There was something wrong with him. This wasn't Jack, not the Jack she knew, not the man she had married. His eyes had changed, his posture had shifted as though he were being controlled by something that wasn't human. She backed away further, her mind whirling as the whispers from the walls began again. Emma, Emma. And then it hit her. The realization that chilled her to the bone. Jack wasn't Jack anymore. He was something else. The figure that had stalked her in the attic, the shadow that had moved just out of reach, had been waiting for her to let her guard down. And now it had taken Jack. No. She couldn't let it take her too. In that instant, everything became clear. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house, now. There was no time to explain. There was no time to reason. If she stayed, she'd become just another whisper in the walls. Jack, stay back, she screamed, her voice breaking as she turned and ran for the front door. The house seemed to fight her every step of the way, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet, the doors refusing to open. But she wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to stay. She had to escape, or she'd never leave this house alive. The front door was just ahead, but as her fingers touched the handle, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, echoing in the hall. The whispers grew louder, sharper, more insistent. They were closing in. Emma's fingers gripped the cold metal of the front door handle, her entire body trembling as she twisted it, desperate to feel the release of the house. But the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. Or, she realized with growing horror, the house itself refused to let her out. Her pulse hammered in her chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She heard the footsteps again, closer this time, unmistakable. Jack's footsteps. But they didn't sound like his anymore. They were too heavy, too slow, deliberate in their pacing. Stay back, she thought, backing away from the door, her eyes flicking to the shadows in the hall. She was trapped. The house was trapping her. It didn't want her to leave. It didn't want her to escape. The whispers were getting louder, becoming a cacophony in her ears. They weren't just in the walls anymore. They were in the air, swirling around her like a swarm of insects, each voice merging into the other until it was impossible to distinguish one from the next. They were suffocating her. Emma, come back. You belong here. Come back. Her mind felt like it was unraveling. She could barely think, could barely breathe. She had to get out. She had to fight. Jack, she cried, her voice hoarse as she spun around looking for him. What's happening to you? What are you? A low, guttural laugh interrupted her. It wasn't Jack's laugh. It wasn't human. It came from somewhere deep within him. Something dark, something ancient, and it filled her with a cold dread that chilled her to the bone. The man who had once been her husband stood at the end of the hallway now, his form barely visible in the dim light, his eyes glowing faintly yellow. His face was pale, stretched thin, and his expression was twisted into a grotesque smile. But it was more than a smile. It was a mockery of one. No. Emma's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't Jack. This was the thing that had claimed him. The house had taken him. It had taken his soul and molded him into something else. Something worse. Jack, she whispered, voice breaking. Please, don't do this. The thing that had once been Jack stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, each step echoing in the silence like a death knell. His eyes, no, its eyes, never left her, never blinked, watching her with an unsettling hunger. "You don't understand, Emma," it said, its voice warped and alien, like 1,000 voices blending together in a single breath. "We never leave this house. We never leave, and neither will you." The words slithered into her mind like poison. "We never leave." The whispers swelled again, louder now, pulling at her, clawing at her resolve. The walls around her seemed to close in, the house itself tightening its grip on her. It was the house, and it was alive. It had always been alive, feeding off the pain, the fear, the lives it claimed. Emma's fingers curled around the key in her hand once more. The tarnished metal felt cold, a sharp reminder that this was the only way out. But where did it fit? She didn't know. She didn't have time to think about it. She had to act before she was swallowed whole by the darkness in the house. Her eyes scanned the room. There was no escape through the door. She had to get away from this thing that had taken Jack. She had to find another way. And then it hit her. The attic. She had to go back. She had to go to the place where the house had first shown her its secrets. The hidden room, the chest with the key. It was the only place left to go. Maybe there was something she was missing, something she hadn't discovered yet. She turned sharply and sprinted toward the hallway, the key gripped tightly in her hand. Behind her, she could hear the thing following her, its footsteps slow but relentless, dragging through the house like a phantom in pursuit. No time. No time. The stairs creaked under her feet as she rushed up toward the attic, her chest burning from the exertion. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to know if it was getting closer. She just needed to reach the attic. She needed to understand why the house was doing this, what it wanted from her, and how she could stop it. She burst through the attic door, slamming it shut behind her. Her breathing was ragged, her mind spinning. The room was the same as it had been before, silent and still. But the air was colder now, more suffocating. Emma turned to the far corner of the room where the hidden passageway still lay. The wall was as solid as ever, the indentation still there. She pressed her hand against it, feeling the slight give in the wood, and for the first time she didn't hesitate. The wall shifted easily beneath her hand, sliding open like a door, revealing the dark passage beyond. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but she didn't stop. She stepped inside the narrow space, her heart racing as the walls seemed to close in on her. The passage was shorter than before, the air growing colder with each step. She had to reach the chest again. She had to find the answers, or she would never leave this place. The passage opened up to the small, hidden room once more. The chest was waiting for her, sitting in the center of the room, just as it had been before. The carvings on the surface still gleamed faintly in the low light. She moved toward it, her hands trembling as she placed the key in the lock. Click. The chest creaked open. Inside, the faded clothes were still there, but beneath them, beneath the fabric, there was something else. A book. It was small, bound in leather, old and cracked, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was embossed with a symbol she didn't recognize, an eye, surrounded by twisting vines almost like a sigil. She reached for it. Her fingers brushed the cover, and a sharp, jarring pain shot through her wrist like a bolt of electricity. The whispers, the voices, surged in her mind, louder now, filling her thoughts. She could hear them, feel them, pushing against her skull. It's time. The voices were clearer now. You are ours. Emma clutched the book in her hands, her pulse pounding in her ears. The air was thick with anticipation. She had what she needed now. But did she have the strength to escape? The moment Emma touched the book, everything around her seemed to distort. The air grew heavy, pressing in on her from all sides, thick with a palpable sense of dread. The voices in her mind swirled, no longer whispers, but screaming in unison, each one louder than the last. They were in her thoughts, clawing at the edges of her sanity. You are ours, they hissed. You will never leave. Her fingers trembled as she held the book. The dark, leather cover cracked beneath her touch. She could feel its weight, not just in her hands, but in her soul. It was as though it had always been a part of her, waiting to be found, waiting for this moment. She wanted to throw it down, to run, to escape. But she couldn't. The pull was too strong. The pages inside were yellowed with age, their edges worn and frayed. As she turned the first page, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked underfoot, as if the house itself were alive, watching her, listening. The words on the page were written in an unfamiliar language, symbols and glyphs that seemed to move before her eyes, shifting like snakes across the surface of the paper. But even though she couldn't understand the words, she felt their meaning in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just a book, it was a record, a history of the house, a record of the souls it had claimed. As she flipped through the pages, each one showed more of the same, a journal of sorts, chronicling the countless victims who had come before her. Their names, their faces, some faded, some still sharp as if they had just been written. She felt a strange compulsion to read each one, to know them. And then on the very last page, her breath caught. It was her name, her full name, Emma Hawthorne. The letters seemed to glow faintly as she stared at them, and the symbols around her name pulsed with an unnatural energy. The last entry in the book was not written like the others. It was a prophecy, a warning, scrawled in jagged, frantic handwriting. The house calls, the souls will rise, the blood must be spilled, and you will be the last. She recoiled, dropping the book as though it had burned her. The room spun around her, the walls constricting, the shadows closing in. The voices were deafening now, each one shouting at her, demanding her attention. The thing that had once been Jack was behind her now, standing in the doorway of the hidden room. She could hear its breath, ragged, unnatural. It wasn't human anymore. It was a thing of the house, just like the whispers, just like everything else. Emma scrambled backward, but there was no escape. The passageway, the door, the chest, they had all vanished. The walls of the hidden room had closed in around her, and the ceiling seemed to be lowering, pressing her down, trapping her in this tiny, suffocating space. The thing's eyes gleamed, those cold, unfeeling yellow eyes, as it took another step forward. It opened its mouth, but no words came out. Only a rasping hiss, like the sound of dry leaves scraping together in the wind. She had to leave. She had to get out. But there was no way out. No way to escape the house. She had to fight. She had to survive. Her eyes darted around the room. The book was still on the ground, the last page open to her name. The walls were beginning to pulse now, vibrating with a terrible energy, and she realized with growing horror that the house was alive, alive in ways she hadn't understood before. It was feeding off them, feeding off the souls it trapped within its walls. And it had been waiting for her all along. Her name written in that book was the final step. She wasn't just the next victim, she was the last. She stumbled to her feet, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The thing that had once been Jack was only a few feet away now, and the shadows around it were thickening, drawing closer, swallowing the light. But then she remembered the key. The key. It was still in her hand. The tarnished cold metal. The one thing that had opened the hidden passage. The one thing that had allowed her to discover the secrets of the house. It had to mean something. There had to be a way out. She turned back to the wall, the key still gripped in her trembling fingers. There was no time to waste. The shadows were already closing in around her, creeping across the floor, curling around her legs like the fingers of some monstrous creature. Her hand flew to the indentation in the wall, and she pressed the key into the slot. For a moment, nothing happened. The room seemed to hold its breath, and then, click. The wall in front of her groaned and shifted, opening once again to reveal the dark passageway. She didn't hesitate. She bolted. Her legs burned as she sprinted through the narrow corridor, the air thick and suffocating, the walls pressing in on either side. The house was alive behind her, chasing her, but Emma couldn't look back. She couldn't stop. She had to get out. The passage opened up to the attic again, but when she stumbled out into the room, she wasn't alone. The thing that had once been Jack was standing there, blocking the door. His eyes gleamed in the dark, the shadows twisting around him like living things. And Emma knew. This was it. This was the final moment. Her mind raced for a plan, for an escape. She couldn't fight him. She couldn't fight the house. But she could make it stop. She turned and ran toward the window, throwing it open with all her strength, the cold air rushing in. The view outside was distorted, as though the world itself had been twisted into something unnatural, something wrong. But there was something else, a faint light on the horizon, something distant, something real. She had to make it there. She had to escape. She turned back to face Jack. No, the thing that was Jack, and saw that the shadows had begun to move. They were coming for her. And then, as she made one last desperate lunge for the window, the house screamed. She dove out of the window, her body weightless as she fell into the night. The world was spinning around her, but there was one thing Emma knew. The house would never have her. Emma's body crashed through the air, the ground rushing toward her in a blur of shapes and shadows. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The cold night air, the oppressive weight of the house, the thing that had once been Jack, all suspended in time. She was weightless, free, and for a split second she believed she had escaped it all. But the earth was closing in fast. She hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, pain shooting through her body, but the pain was nothing compared to the sheer terror that surged in her chest. She scrambled to her feet, gasping for breath, her limbs shaking with exhaustion, her heart still racing in her ears. The house loomed behind her, dark and twisted against the backdrop of the night sky. The window she had leaped from was now a distant memory, the open space she had fallen through vanishing as if the house had swallowed it up whole. But she didn't care. She was out. She had to be. She didn't wait to look back. She didn't dare. If she did, she knew she wouldn't be able to move. She ran. Her legs burned as she sprinted across the overgrown lawn, the trees looming like silent sentinels on either side. The house was no longer visible behind her, but she could feel it. It was still there, waiting, watching. Don't look back. Her mind screamed at her, pushing her to keep moving, to escape. The voices, the whispers had quieted for now, but the dread inside her chest never fully faded. The house was alive. It would always be alive, and it would never forget her. The path ahead was unfamiliar, the woods dense and dark, but Emma didn't care. She couldn't stop. Her mind was numb, focused only on survival. She didn't know where she was running, didn't know if she was heading toward safety or further into the depths of the nightmare. But as long as she was moving, as long as she was out of that house, it was enough. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body aching from the fall and the sheer terror of what she had just escaped. But there was no time to rest. She couldn't stop. Not yet. The trees parted ahead and Emma stumbled into a clearing. In the distance, she saw something. A faint glow in the distance, like a distant streetlight, a beacon. She wasn't alone. Her heart lurched in her chest as she saw the figure standing just outside the clearing, bathed in the eerie glow of the light. The figure was still, unmoving. It was a woman, tall, dressed in flowing clothes, her long hair billowing in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes dark pools of sorrow and something else, something ancient. Emma didn't know who she was, but something about her made her pause. The figure seemed familiar. She knew she should be running, but she couldn't. She couldn't turn away. The woman's eyes met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The wind stilled. The forest fell silent. "You've made it out," the woman said, her voice soft and gentle, but with an underlying sorrow that echoed through Emma's bones. Emma swallowed hard, still panting from her flight. Who are you? What is this place? Why can't I escape? The woman stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Emma's. You are not the first to escape, she said, but you will be the last. The house does not let go easily. It never does. Emma's heart raced again. What do you mean? What is that house? What does it want from me? The woman's expression darkened, her lips trembling as though she was struggling to speak. It wants your soul, Emma. It has always wanted it. The house feeds on the lives of those it traps. It takes them, consumes them. But you... She paused, her eyes flicking to the woods, as though afraid to speak further. You were always different. The bloodline. The Hawthorne curse runs deep. Curse? Emma echoed, shaking her head in disbelief. What curse? I don't understand. The woman raised her hand, cutting her off gently. You don't have much time. The house will come for you. It always does. But if you want to break its hold, if you want to truly escape, you must leave this place behind. And the only way to do that is to sever the bond, the key, the book. Emma's heart dropped. The book? But it was the book. It was in the house. It's all connected. What do you mean, sever the bond? The woman's gaze turned distant, her eyes clouded with sorrow. The book contains the souls of all who have been taken. Your family, mine, and every soul the house has claimed. To break free, to destroy the house, you must return what it has stolen. The truth hit Emma like a physical blow. The house had been feeding off her bloodline, feeding off the pain and fear of those who had come before her. The souls in the book, they weren't just trapped in those pages, they were part of the house, part of its twisted, insatiable hunger. But how? Emma whispered. How can I stop it? The woman's expression softened. Return to the house. Face what it has become, and destroy the book. Destroy its heart. Only then will the curse be broken. The words hung heavy in the air. A final, impossible choice. Emma felt the weight of them in her bones. It was the only way to end this, to end the cycle of suffering and death. But the thought of going back into the house, of facing whatever had taken Jack, whatever had become of it, made her blood run cold. She was already running from it. She had escaped. She had... A sharp pain shot through her chest and she gasped, looking down at the ground, at the dark shapes growing at her feet. The shadows were back, and they were closing in. The house was not finished with her. It was calling her back. But Emma knew what she had to do now. She couldn't let the darkness win. The shadows crept closer, wrapping around Emma's legs like tendrils of dark smoke. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her breath quickening. The woman in the clearing remained unmoving, her eyes wide, a sorrowful understanding in her gaze. The air grew heavy with dread. The house was calling her back. The oppressive force from the woods pressed in on her, pushing her toward the path she had just fled. The air felt charged with a dark energy, almost as if the very trees themselves were conspiring to force her into the house once more. The weight of the curse, the bloodline, and the ancient evil that had followed her for so long seemed to settle upon her like a cloak. You don't have to go back, the woman said softly, her voice strained with a deep sadness. But if you don't, the house will never stop. It will follow you, wherever you go. It will drag you down. Emma's mind spun, her body frozen in place. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare once and for all. But the woman's words held a painful truth. She had already made the choice by touching the book. The house's grip on her was too strong. It had always been too strong. She clenched her fists, steeling herself. I'll do it. I'll end it. The woman nodded, her expression solemn. You must sever the bond. But be warned, the house will fight. It will not let you go without a price. Emma felt the pull of the house again, like an invisible thread tugging at her very soul. She could feel it, deep inside, like a weight, a presence. It was waiting for her. She turned and began to run. The dark path ahead was the only way to end this, the only way to free herself and everyone it had claimed. The clearing was disappearing behind her as the trees closed in, the oppressive weight of the forest thickening with each step. She could feel the house growing closer, its presence swelling as if it had been waiting for this moment. Her chest tightened, but she didn't stop. The house was calling, and she would answer. The path wound through the woods, the way darker with each passing second, the twisted branches of the trees creating a maze. She could hear the wind picking up, but it wasn't just the wind. It was the sound of the house itself, its breath, its heartbeat. It was coming for her. But the light was still ahead. The distant glow she had seen earlier was growing larger, sharper like a lantern in the distance, a beacon of hope. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she had to trust it. And then she saw it, there, in the distance, looming over the trees, rising up like a great malevolent giant. The house. It was waiting for her, its windows dark and empty like unblinking eyes. The door was wide open, as if welcoming her back. She had returned. Her legs felt heavy as she approached the front steps, every movement fighting against the overwhelming pressure of the house. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let it win. She stepped inside. The house was the same, and yet, it was different. The air was thick with a sense of finality, as if it knew this was the last time it would ever be able to claim someone. The walls were cold, the floorboards creaking under her feet as she made her way toward the heart of the house, the room that had once held the chest, the key, and the book. The whispers had returned, louder now, swarming around her like insects. You cannot escape. The voices were many, indistinct, yet all filled with the same cold malice. You belong here. You are ours. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself forward. The attic door was ahead of her, the same door she had fled through so many hours ago, and yet it felt like a lifetime. She approached it cautiously, the weight of the house pressing against her back, its invisible fingers clutching at her soul. She pushed open the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The attic was just as she remembered it, dark, suffocating, filled with dust and the remains of forgotten things. But now, something else lingered in the air. A presence. The house itself. And there, in the center of the room, was the chest. Her breath caught. The same chest. The one she had opened before. The one that had given her the key. The book. It stood like a dark monument, waiting for her to return. Emma hesitated only a moment before she moved toward it. She had no choice. The house had claimed so many before her, her ancestors, Jack, and it wouldn't stop until it had taken her too. The book, the key, the chest, they were all part of it. They were the heart of it. She opened the chest. Inside was the book, its pages now glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. And beneath it, a small gleaming object, a dagger, sharp and silver, with an ornate handle, carved with the same sigil as the one on the book's cover. Her pulse quickened. She knew what she had to do. The moment her fingers touched the dagger, the house shuddered. The walls groaned. The air vibrated with a low, threatening hum. The shadows in the corners of the room swelled and shifted, gathering around her like a storm. It was trying to stop her. It would fight. But she had no choice. She lifted the dagger, the cold metal slick against her palm. The whispers were deafening now, a shrill cacophony that tore at her sanity. "You cannot," they screamed. "We are eternal. You cannot break us." With one final cry of defiance, Emma plunged the dagger into the book. The moment it made contact, the entire house seemed to scream in agony. The walls shuddered violently, the floor beneath her feet cracked open, and the ground split apart. But Emma didn't falter. She twisted the dagger, the blade scraping against the pages, until, Crack. The book's pages burst into flames, the flames licking the edges of the house, consuming everything in its path. The darkness retreated, the oppressive weight lifting from her shoulders. The shadows vanished. The whispers died. Emma collapsed to her knees as the house trembled and groaned. The light from the flames grew brighter, more intense, until it enveloped the entire room, blinding her with its radiance. And then, nothing. Emma opened her eyes, the warmth of the sun on her face. The world was quiet. The air was clear. But what had happened to the house? Emma blinked against the blinding light. For a moment, everything felt like a dream. Disjointed, unreal, as though the world she had known no longer existed. The heat of the fire still tingled on her skin, but the air was different now. Clearer, fresher. The oppressive weight of the house, the shadows, the whispers, they were gone. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, her body aching from the fall, from the stress of the past days. The room, the attic, everything around her was still, silent. She looked around, her heart racing in her chest. The chest, the book, the dagger, they were gone, vanished as though they had never been there. The attic was nothing but an empty space, its dusty corners untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded. There was no fire, no destruction, no house. Emma stumbled to the window, half expecting to see the twisted, dark silhouette of the mansion looming in the distance. But instead, she was greeted by a wide expanse of open land, rolling hills, a bright blue sky. The sun hung low in the horizon, casting long, warm shadows across the landscape. It was a scene of peace, of calm. She could hardly believe her eyes. The house was gone. She stepped back from the window, her breath coming in uneven bursts. She was outside. She had made it out. But something was still off. The weight of the book, the key, the curse. It still lingered somewhere deep within her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something, that something was unfinished. A voice broke her thoughts, soft, distant, like the rustle of wind through leaves. "Emma?" She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The woman from the clearing, the one who had told her about the curse, the house, the key, was standing in the doorway. Her pale, sorrowful eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "Is it over?" Emma whispered, her voice hoarse. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "For you, yes. You broke the cycle. The house is no more. But..." Emma trailed off, her mind racing. How? How did it happen? Was it really the book? Was it the dagger? The woman took a slow step forward, her gaze still fixed on Emma. The house existed because it fed on the souls of those it trapped. The book, the chest, the key, they were all parts of it. Tools to keep the curse alive. You severed the bond. The house cannot hurt anyone anymore. It is gone. Emma's mind struggled to process the woman's words. And what about the souls? The people it trapped? What happens to them? The woman's eyes softened. They are free. They are at peace now. They were always waiting for someone strong enough to end it, to return what had been taken. Emma nodded slowly, a sense of deep, quiet relief flooding through her. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for what felt like an eternity was finally gone. The house, its curse, its endless cycle of suffering, it was over. She had broken it. She had freed herself and all those who had come before her. But there was still something nagging at her, something she couldn't quite place. "And you?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about you? Why were you there in the woods?" The woman's gaze darkened slightly, her expression hardening for a moment. Then her shoulders relaxed and she smiled, a soft, sad smile. "I was one of the first," she said quietly. "One of the first souls trapped by the house. My name was Eliza Hawthorne. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Eliza. The realization hit Emma like a thunderclap. She understood now. The woman standing before her, the woman who had helped her, who had guided her through this nightmare, was part of her bloodline. She was family. Another Hawthorne lost to the curse. Another soul bound to the house. You, Emma began, her voice faltering. You were trapped, just like me. Eliza nodded, her eyes distant, lost in memories. Yes, but I didn't escape. Not until you did. The curse was never meant to end with me. It was meant to end with you. Emma stepped closer, a lump forming in her throat. You helped me. You helped me break the curse. Eliza's gaze softened, a gentle sadness in her eyes. I helped you because I couldn't escape, but you can. You are free, Emma. The house can never take you now. Emma's throat tightened. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched Eliza's arm. She could feel the chill that lingered there, the echo of a life long lost. I don't understand, Emma whispered. If you were trapped, how can you be free now? How can I help you? Eliza smiled faintly, her eyes closing for a moment. I am free because you are. The curse was always tied to your bloodline, but you broke it. You saved all of us. A soft wind blew through the window, the breeze carrying with it the scent of earth and grass, of freedom. Eliza looked out into the distance, a quiet peace settling over her features. I will always be here, Emma, she said softly, as long as you remember me. The moment stretched between them, timeless and fragile. Emma felt the last of the tension in her body release, as though the weight of the curse had been lifted from her soul, leaving her free. And then, in a shimmer of light, Eliza was gone. Emma stood in the empty room, feeling the last remnants of the house's grip fade from her body. The room was still, the world outside calm, untouched by the horrors of the past. The house, the book, the key, they were gone. The nightmare was over. But as she stepped away from the window and turned toward the door, she felt something else. A strange, quiet understanding, a sense of peace she had never known before. The past had been closed. The house was nothing but a memory now, and it was time to move on. She was free. And she would never forget the price that had been paid to bring her here. Emma stepped outside into the sunlight, her heart lighter than it had ever been. The house was behind her, and before her stretched a future full of possibilities. She was no longer bound by the curse, no longer a prisoner of her bloodline's dark past. She was free, and she would live, knowing the house's curse would never again haunt anyone else.